So we're increasing the gap between the trigger and how we respond.
The way the courts function favors the toxic person.
We just drag ourselves further down the hole.
We're not trying to impact the actions of the other person. We're trying to support our kids.
Welcome to Awaken Her, the podcast where women find their strength and transform their pain into power. I'm Corissa Stepp, your guide on this journey of healing, growth, and empowerment. Here we share the real stories of women who have faced life's toughest challenges and emerged stronger, together with expert insights to light your path forward. Whether you're seeking to heal, grow, or empower your life after heartache, Awaken Her is here to show you that not only is change possible, but you are capable of achieving more than you ever imagined. Let's dive into today's episode and take another step towards becoming your most empowered self. Hey everyone. Welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Corissa Stepp. And today I am going to be chatting with Veronika Archer about how to co-parent or parallel parent with your narcissistic ex. Veronika is a mom to 3 young adult boys and a narcissistic trauma recovery coach, supporting high achievers to heal from long-term impacts of emotional trauma so they're free to create their legacy. She supports forward-thinking parents to break free from co-parenting with a toxic ex and empower their kids to thrive despite narcissistic sabotage. Veronika, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. So I would love to pick your brain on this topic today because this comes up so much in my conversations, especially with my clients, about how to prevent their narcissistic ex from number one, like sabotaging their relationship with their kids, because sometimes we see a lot of parental alienation, right? Through disparagement and all these like really unkind things that are being said by the narcissistic ex. And then how they can be there to be that support that the children need through such a difficult transition.
Yeah, really good questions. So I'll start with the first one, which was how to prevent your ex from parental alienation and sabotaging your relationship. So the very first thing to know is that you cannot prevent your ex from doing those things. If your ex is truly has a personality disorder, like narcissistic personality disorder, they're going to do those things. So if you have an ex who has been displaying toxic or unhealthy or manipulative behavior for whatever reason, but they don't truly have a personality disorder, then some of the strategies that we might be talking about today, or strategies that your clients may have learned from you or from other sources, will likely change that person's behavior. When you set clear boundaries, when you communicate in a way that's specific to toxic behaviors, that person will change. If your ex is truly NPD or in a cluster B personality disorder, their behaviors will not change. And I think this is really important to understand, because what I see people getting really caught up with is, if I can just get my ex to change, everything will be better. If I can just get the courts to see what my ex is doing, everything will get better. If I can just, get full custody. So the focus so often for people, and I was there too, right, is that you want the other person's behaviors to change, because those behaviors can be so damaging. And it's really important to understand that nothing you do will change those behaviors. So my kids are, young adults. I've implemented the tools that we're going to be talking about today. And I just this week, my oldest son commented to me about negative things that his dad is saying to him about me still, right? So that's the very first thing. And I think it's really important, because when you understand that, then you can stop focusing on what the ex is doing and trying to change that, because people really get stuck. And that's where things don't change, because if you're focused on your ex's behaviors and trying to change your ex's behaviors, or trying to get other people to believe that your ex is doing the things that you're saying that they're doing, you're going to be stuck there. And your kids are going to suffer, and you're going to suffer, and you're not going to move forward in creating this beautiful life that you want. So that's the very first thing that is really important to understand.
Yeah. I mean, I think it just depletes your energy, because you're trying to control someone else, and you can't control anyone else's behaviors. You can't control how other people think or feel or what they express or what they do. And nor can you impact how other people are perceiving that behavior, those words, or whatever it is that they're saying as well. So it's really hard. I just have a quick question. And I know you want to keep going, but I just have a quick question, which is, you mentioned that with NPD, it's going to be different than someone who has narcissistic tendencies. And I feel a little bit differently about that in the sense that most narcissists don't get the NPD diagnosis. So it's very hard to discern whether or not someone can actually change based on purely a diagnosis or not.
Yes, that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up because when I talk about NPD or somebody having a personality disorder, I don't mean to imply that they have been diagnosed because most of the time they're not. I call my ex NPD, even though he's never been diagnosed, and I'm sure he would fight me saying that. But I know that he is because he is so consistent and he does literally every one of the characteristics that go with NPD, and it doesn't change. And so that's why, one of the first things I commented on is that whether the X is diagnosed, whether they truly are or are not NPD or something similar in that cluster B, these things that we're talking about will work either way. Because like I said, if they're not NPD, then their actions will change, which is really cool. If they are NPD, whether diagnosed or not, actually their actions still will change, but not to the same degree. And the point is that we're not trying to impact the actions of the other person, but rather we're trying to support our kids and ourselves in really having beautiful, healthy lives. So yeah, I agree with you that a lot of them are undiagnosed and it's really irrelevant. So if you're listening and you're like, well, I don't know if my ex is NPD. Oh my goodness, please don't dive down the rabbit hole of trying to diagnose them. A lot of us get caught up in that. Just know if they do some of the things that we talk about, and Chris, maybe, I don't know if you want to address that, but there's certain behaviors that you see that you're like, okay, my ex is toxic, maybe NPD, maybe in that spectrum, and I need to implement these tools instead of co-parenting.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even with NPD, it only lists like 9 traits of behaviors. There's a lot more than that. So it goes a lot deeper. So I even discourage people from looking at the DSM-5 and looking at those 9 traits and behaviors because your ex might have 4 out of 9 or 5 out of 9. And then what does that mean? Are they less of an NPD? Are they more or less of a narcissist? And then is it even worth your time to try and diagnose? Because when we're out trying to seek a diagnosis or trying to label or define whether or not they are a narcissist, it's almost like because we need that validation of our experience, but we can do that validation for ourselves just by understanding the patterns and understanding, what their patterns are versus what we've experienced and what narcissistic patterns of manipulation and their tactics and how they show up and how they behave. And that can give us the validation that we need without having that rubber stamp approval. So I just wanted to kind of mention that.
The things that I normally talk with people that I work with is if your ex is doing one of these things, and you'll notice that I say ex and parent and they, because this can be a man or a woman. So, a lot of times in our healing spaces, we talk about men being narcissistic and men being abusers. And the fact is that women are just as, statistically likely to have NPD as a man. So in case anyone has that question, gender is irrelevant in this conversation. So it's, if your ex never takes responsibility and always blames you for everything, like everything is always your fault. Like even the sky is blue, it's your fault. The sky is blue, and for some reason that's bad. They don't take responsibility for themselves. They're trying to undermine you as a parent. They're trying to sabotage your relationship with your kids. When you try to come to resolution to something, like have a conversation with them about something, education, religion, medical, the things that legally you're required to have a conversation with them about, you just find yourself in endless circular conversations that never get to a resolution. You feel like you're going crazy. You're like, what the heck? And there's probably some more that I can't think of right now, but those are the big ones that if you're experiencing that, then I'm referring to your ex as an NPD or toxic, and the things we're going to be talking about today apply to you. Doesn't matter what their diagnosis is, if they're dual diagnosed or they're narcissist or not yet. As you said, Carissa, do not jump down that rabbit hole of trying to diagnose because you'll make yourself crazy.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll let you continue from there because I know that you were trying to answer one of my questions and I took you a little bit off on a tangent there. So I apologize.
I'm happy to talk about any aspect of this. So I think your first question was around changing their behavior or something. And I said, you can't do that. And then,
but how do we protect ourselves and our children from, I mean, and again, like it's to that point of like, we can't control what they're doing, but how can we do it's really like damage control, right? Like, so we can't control someone else's behavior, but we can do the, putting out the fire and helping the children to feel like they're not caught in between. Because I think that a lot of times this is what happens in these types of relationships when they end.
Absolutely. There are a lot of strategies and tools that people can implement, and we may get to some of those today. I'm not going to talk about them right now in the context of that question for this reason. So one of the things that I have found the most effective and most important to protect your relationship with your child, which then also empowers them to thrive, which is what we ultimately want, right? We want to change the trajectory of our kids' lives, because having a toxic parent, having at least even one toxic parent, can deeply, deeply impact your children. And I want to be very blunt and upfront and transparent about that, because it's a fact. I think for me personally, I think I lived a little bit like with my head in the sand about what the impacts would be to my kids. But we're talking like potential personality disorders in the children, or mood disorders. We're talking self-harm, including suicide and cutting, drug abuse, difficulty, maintaining relationships, depression, anxiety, like really big eating disorders, really big things that can result for our children. So our children are impacted by the fact that they have a toxic parent. So I say that because so many parents are like, Veronika, are my kids going to be okay? And what can I do to make sure they're okay? Your kids are impacted by the fact that they have a toxic parent. End of story. You can stop worrying about that. You can just put that off to the side and be like, okay, radical acceptance, this has happened, right? It's like if your child was in a car accident and had some major injury, it's like, okay, that happened. Cool. Now we want to change the trajectory of our kids' lives. We want to move them away from all these things I just mentioned, right? Self-harm, depression, all those kinds of things, personality disorders potentially, right? So what I have found that can be most effective is shifting your own internal energy. That is the number one thing that I talk about with people in general, but with parents specifically. And oftentimes there's this period, sometimes of like a month or two of working with people. They're like, but Veronika, what's the strategy? Like, how do I communicate with my ex? What do I say to my kids? And it's really hard for people to understand that changing themselves internally is going to have this impact. But okay, here's how I want to put it in perspective, right? Narcissists are magical creatures.
Okay.
Here's what I mean by that. Here's what I hear most often and have myself experienced. The narcissist can go to court, or the toxic ex can go to court, make up all kinds of lies and say all kinds of things, and the courts will believe them. The narcissist so often, or the toxic person so often, is able to convince people that they are this wonderful, amazing person. And I'm going to say narcissist here specifically because this is specific to the NPD personality type versus other types of toxic behaviors. People believe them. They seem to always get what they want, which is why it's so hard when you have kids with them, because like the kids will believe them, and it makes you absolutely crazy. Why is that? I believe it's because they believe what they say with absolute certainty.
Mm-hmm. The confidence.
Yeah, the confidence. But that confident, okay, we know our narcissists are also insecure, so bear with me. But they have this energetic template within themselves that's like, this is how it is. This is what's going to happen. It's this it's a really powerful energy, okay? So once I realized that is when everything changed for me in terms of my healing and what I teach, because I'm like, oh my gosh, it's all about energy. And the thing is, we have the ability to have that really strong, powerful energy as well, in our own way, not in that way, not in the destructive way. And when you combine energy with strategy, with tools, that's when things are successful. If you apply tools and strategy without the energetics, without your own personal healing, without shifting your own template, the strategy and tools are only I'm going to make up a number, like 10% effective or something. They're effective, but just like minimally so. But when you shift your own energy and you add these tools and strategies to it, then you see massive change in yourself and your kids. So I want to talk about that a little bit, that what that energetic shift is that people can make. But I'm going to pause for a minute because I feel like I've been talking for a while. Is there anything you want to ask or add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's I agree with you. Like I can totally see that. And also I feel like the behavior that you're talking about, like it comes off as a false sense of security because the narcissists oftentimes display splitting, or what we call black and white thinking, right? It either is or it isn't. And so that right there gives them that conviction that mirrors what would someone else would have on the outside would perceive it as that they are confident and that what they are speaking is truth.
Exactly. Yes, they have exactly. It's that black and white and that belief that what they're speaking is truth. And so that's sort of what we want to shift into. So one example that you mentioned that I wanted to address was putting the kids in the middle, right? So that's one of the things that's really harmful to the kids. So the strategy might be, okay, I'm not going to talk bad about the ex. I'm going to communicate with the ex and make sure that we're quote unquote co-parenting or making decisions together. And you're like, I'm doing everything I can, but my kids still feel put in the middle. And what I discovered for myself is that even though I was saying and doing the right, quote unquote, right things, within myself, I knew that my ex was talking about me, was damaging my relationship. And I wanted more than anything for my kids to come live with me full time. You know, I didn't pursue that. I didn't go to court for that, but I definitely wanted it in my being. And I wanted them to have less of a relationship with their dad and those kinds of things. And I had a lot of emotion inside myself, you know, anger, resentment towards him and those kinds of things, and the desire for them to be with me. And what I believe is that they can sense that. They pick up on that. Human beings are very intuitive, even if we don't recognize it. Kids have not yet been conditioned to not be intuitive. And so they pick up on even more than we know or believe that they are. So that's why I talk about shifting your energy, because if you can be at a place, I talk about holding the vision, right? So holding the vision of the relationship, that the kind of relationship you want with your child if your ex were not sabotaging it. Holding the vision of the trajectory that you want for your child, the future you want for your child. And I'm not necessarily talking about like, I want my child to be a doctor. I'm talking about like, I want my child to be healthy and happy and have a positive relationship with both of their parents or something like that, right? You hold that vision and then you shift your own internal energy to match the vibration of that vision. So if you're feeling guilt or resentment towards your ex, that's not matching the frequency of I want my child to be healthy and happy and have a positive relationship with their parents, right? Then, so this is a whole process, right? Then you're like, okay, why do I feel guilt and resentment? You use tools like what you share, Corissa, to work on that, right? How do I heal my own guilt and resentment and shift it? This is not about fake positive thinking, right? We don't want to deny how we're feeling, but we do want to recognize how we're feeling and shift it so that our energy shifts. And I want to give two examples. One of why I know this to be true, and two of how this works. So one, how do I know this to be true? Well, my kids are now young adults, and so I have the freedom to have more open conversations with them when they were younger. And my middle son, who's now 20, said to me sometime in this past year about how he and his younger brother really felt put in the middle between me and their dad. And I asked him, I was like, well, why? I was like, why is that? Because I never pressured you to choose. I always supported your relationship with your dad. I didn't say this to him, but I was like, I did all the things I was supposed to in terms of making sure that, dad had equal time, all the things. And he couldn't really think of a specific example other than things his dad was doing. So there were things his dad was doing that was making him and his brother feel put in the middle. But that's when I really sat with it. And that's when I was like, the epiphany of, oh my goodness, I never said anything to the kids, but I felt it and they knew it.
Yeah. I love this because if I can just jump in for a second,
Please.
From a human design perspective, I don't know if you're into human design. Some of my listeners are. Okay. So I'm just thinking even about anyone who has an undefined root center or an undefined head center, right? Those are the two pressure centers in the chart. And this is how it's going to make sense to you. It's like people will implicitly feel you putting pressure on them if you are defined in either of those centers when they are undefined. And it's not that you're doing anything. It's not that you're saying anything. It is literally down to, like you just said, the energetics of it. And to your point, that they will perceive and pick up on the things you're not saying, right? That's the intuition part of it. So yes.
Yeah. And then the second part is that I have seen some amazing shifts. My relationship with my boys they come and go, sometimes they're better, sometimes they're more strained. And, so there are ups and downs even now. But without fail, whenever I shift into a space of like grief or guilt or things like that, I no longer feel resentment towards my ex. Is that true? I'm not sure that that's true. Anytime those emotions come up, my relationships with my kids seem to take a turn for the worse. And every time I shift back into holding the vision, keeping my own energy centered and clear, my relationship with my kids will just, enhance and expand. And this is from, right now, 2 of my kids live in another state. So we're not even in the same house. I don't even see them regularly or that frequently. But even geographically removed, I can be where I am and I can shift my energy, and I'll suddenly like get a message from my son, or we'll have a really beautiful conversation or something like that. So I know this to be true because I have observed it and experienced it within myself. And then of course, doing it with my, teaching my clients this and seeing the shifts that happen. One of the things about energy is, maybe your audience, people listening, maybe they're already connected with sort of the woo. I don't know. But I think a lot of people think of like this energy kind of work and shifting your energy as being, woo. And like, I don't know, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I worked as a biologist for 20 years. And so it's really important to me to, I know something to be true when there's a consistent outcome that can be repeated. And so I've taught this now to many clients, and I've practiced it myself many times, and the outcome is consistently the same. That's why I can confidently say, like, number one thing is shift your own energetic template.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for bringing up your background as a scientist, because that was a very important point I think that people should know, because absolutely, this isn't just coming out of nowhere. It's not this like crazy woo-woo, airy fairy kind of stuff. Like there's evidence, right? We have evidence. You've done the experiments. You've tried this. Your clients have tried this.
I'm all about experiments. I experimented on my kids. I'm so sorry, but I did. I mean, we all do, I guess, parents, right?
I was going to say, yeah, parenting is just one giant experiment.
It's just one giant experiment. Anyways, did that answer your original question? I can't remember.
I think you did. Honestly, like what you're sharing is so helpful. So you've definitely given us so much value already. So I'd love for you to kind of keep going if you have got more that you want to share in terms of like the tools, because now it's like, okay, so how do I go about shifting my energy aside from like holding the vision, and what else can we do? Because like for me, like as an EFT practitioner, like that's one ways in which I use to help shift people's energy, right? To help them release the stagnancies. It's also a lot about, and outside of just EFT, like a lot of the work that I do, there's a lot of somatic work, right? So we're working constantly with the body. We're constantly working on understanding our nervous system, how to address our emotional triggers, how to release all of that, because then we can get to a place, I hope, because this is kind of where I feel like I have done this work on myself and where I see that I'm headed, which is that acceptance piece that you touched on before. It's like you come into this acceptance of the other person, but it's also an acceptance of yourself and where you're at, so that you can be true to how you're feeling, acknowledging what you're feeling, but then also allowing yourself to process and move through it so that you're not stuck in that energy of it, right? So like you mentioned, that guilt that a lot of parents feel, especially when they only have their kids half the time. And if they were the ones who made the decision to get out of the relationship because they recognized that it wasn't healthy, then it can impact the time that they spend with their kids, because then they're making parenting decisions based upon that guilt, as opposed to doing it from this place of love and this understanding that, okay, I know this was my choice. Yes, there's a part of me that feels bad for it, but I can feel that and I can release it so that when I'm with my kids, I'm still providing them with the structure and the discipline that they need, but also the compassion and the empathy.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's so many things I could touch on there, but I want to give, those of you listening some tools to kind of walk away with if you don't already have them. So first of all, I just want to touch on what you were talking about, because you mentioned somatic and emotional and things like that. I talk about healing on 7 energy layers, and I am offering a free masterclass in February on that. And so that is something that is really important, is that what I've noticed is where people get stuck is they've only focused on 1 or 2 layers, and it's what you were just talking about, right? It's the emotions, it's the body, it's the energy, it's the knowledge, it's, So I'm not going to go into that too much right now, but I just wanted to highlight what you just said about healing on all these different ways. It's so important. And if you are a parent and you have partial custody or like shared custody, so you have time alone, it is so, so, so important when your kids are not with you, as you just said, Corissa, to focus on your own healing. I mean, that's the biggest benefit you can give to your kids. And if you are somebody who's spending your quote unquote free time rewriting the perfect email or text message to your ex because you're trying to resolve something, if you are in court and you are spending hours and hours and hours collecting information for court, those are some signs that there's something not going correctly or well in the way you interact with your ex. And I want to really encourage people listening, if this is you, what I just described, to get help from someone like Corissa or myself, or there's other resources out there, to get out of the fight. If it's been more than a year since you've left your ex and you're in court frequently and you're spending a lot of your time dealing with court matters, you want to get yourself out of the fight. The courts are set up, not intentionally, but the way the courts function favors the toxic person. And the toxic person loves to fight with you, and they will fight with you forever. And I promise you, if you're somebody who's like, I get so riled up about this because I have clients going through this who are like, oh, when I get to this court decision, then I can work on healing. Then I can work on parenting. I need the courts to make this decision, whatever it is, custody, money, etc. I promise you that decision is not going to give you the result that you're hoping for in terms of now I'm free to do my next step. It's not going to happen. You're going to stay fighting forever. And you have the ability to get the result you want right now, even if there is something that needs to be settled in court. There are things that need to be settled in court. I'm not saying never go to court, right? Custody, you need a custody agreement. You need a divorce, a divorce settlement. All of those things are important. However, you should be spending like very small amounts of time. And the questions you have that you believe need to get resolved are not going to get resolved in court. They're going to get resolved through the work and strategies that Chris and I are talking about here. So that's first. Oh my goodness, if you're fighting with your ex and in court and spending lots and lots of time dealing with your ex, then you need help, and please get help because you will be there. Like I had a client, she came to me 3 years ago and decided that she was going to go through court, and then came back to me 3 years later and was like, I need to work with you now. And things are really, really, really bad. I won't go into details, but really bad. I have another person I spoke with who's been in court for 12 years. So like, please don't do that. If you're listening, please don't do that. Get help.
Yeah, I had a woman, I'm just going to just share this real quickly because it's like not related to court, but this, as to your point, you mentioned this, but I want to just highlight it. I had this conversation with a woman who has been divorced from her ex for like almost a decade, remarried, right, for like 7 or 8 years, and still gets triggered by every text and interaction she has with her ex, and spends hours writing and rewriting those text messages and her correspondence back to him, that she gets herself so worked up that she hasn't been able to heal from it. And it's impacted her relationship with her kids. It's impacted her quality of life. It's impacted her health. And it's just like, what we're basically doing is like, as we continue to engage in that way with the narcissist, we just drag ourselves further down the hole.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you brought that up because that was the second point. So the first point, right, is when your kids are not with you, and even if they are, especially if you're a parent who has primary custody of your children, it's really important to focus on your own healing. And if you don't have the time or resources to do that, get help so that you can learn how to get the time and resources to do that, because it's the most important thing. Okay, the other thing was second point is what you just mentioned, triggers and ruminations. Learning how to not get triggered. It is 100% possible to communicate with your ex. If you're a parent, you are communicating with your ex, you probably have to, right? And to not get triggered. But it is a process. And it's the healing work, Corissa, that you do in terms of, really understanding what is underneath that trigger. And that's one of my specialties as well, right? Is understanding what is causing you to be triggered. And one of the clients that I worked with, she came to me because she had been in therapy for 18 months and found therapy helpful and useful and all those things, but she was still feeling triggered. And when I use that word, it's like what you just described. It's you get a message and now you're hours and hours or days of emotions, of trying to solve it. Maybe you're, curled up in the fetal position in bed, eating everything in your refrigerator, whatever your response is, right? So that's what I mean when I say triggered. And So she came to me because her therapist told her she couldn't be free from triggers. She would just have to learn how to manage them. And I was like, no, 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 no. And within, I forget how long she said, I think within like 3 months, she was at a point where the trigger would last minutes. So she would still have an emotional response, but it was like minutes, and now she's, a couple years out and she doesn't feel triggers at all anymore. So one, self-healing. Two, which is related to the self-healing, is being free from triggers. It's going to be almost impossible for you to parent effectively if you're triggered by your ex. And then also you're going to be triggered by your kids because they might be saying things that is really coming from your ex. They might have characteristics that remind you of your ex. They might just be freaking, kids who do things that is difficult to deal with, right?
Or they come home from your ex's house, and because you're the safe parent, they just, they're completely emotionally dysregulated. And then that can cause you to get dysregulated. And then you're in a heightened situation that doesn't feel good for anyone.
Exactly. I want to talk about that third. So, and then also you might be getting triggered by like therapists or court, lawyers, judges, teachers who don't understand what it's like to have a manipulative ex, because it's a very specific experience. So learning how to not be triggered and healing, which is really closely connected to the first point of self-healing, is really, really important for you to effectively parent. So those are the first two steps. Then the third one is what you just mentioned, Corissa, is what your child is experiencing at the other parent's house. So it's really important to recognize that your child is experiencing trauma consistently if they still have contact with the other parent. So their nervous system is dysregulated. They feel unsafe. And that results in all these kinds of behaviors like you just mentioned, coming from the other parent's house. You're the safe parent and now they're able to just explode all over the place and things like that. And the reason I say that is so important to recognize is because the first two things that I just mentioned, your self-healing and being free from triggers, your child is going to reflect your state of being. So we're back to the energetics and then picking up on your emotions and your energy. If you're regulated, it's going to help them regulate. So first of all, that's part of it. The other part is that the way that most of us, I think, or a lot, culturally, we're sort of taught to parent, like you had mentioned, like discipline and structure and boundaries. Yes, those things are important for a child. However, the way you choose to parent when they have a toxic ex is probably going to look different. And the reason for that is a couple things. One, they are receiving no validation or very little validation, very little love, very little meeting of their needs when they're at the other parent's house. They're probably spending all of their emotional energy meeting the needs of the parent, whether it's emotional needs or sometimes they're actually parenting the other parent. There's all kinds of things happening. So their needs are not being met. And when they come to you, they need that. They need you to connect with them. They need you to meet their emotional needs. It is not the time for discipline and boundaries. It's just not. And it's something that's really, really difficult because other parents who don't have this, who are co-parenting or have a partner, a healthy partner, they're like, why aren't you setting more boundaries for your children? Why do you do so many things for your children? And they might think that you're an overly permissive parent, but it's even more important for you to really connect with your kids. So when they come back from the other parent's house and they're having that emotional reaction on transition day, you recognize that. And instead of being like, well, no, whatever, video games for you because you're yelling at me, instead it's like, oh, maybe you need to go to your room and relax and unwind or be angry. Or maybe you plan something physical because physical movement is really good for processing those emotions, But you don't implement structure and discipline on transition day. 100% not, because they need that space. So the third piece that I wanted, so the first one is self-healing. Second one is being free from triggers. And the third one is understanding that your kids need something different because they are consistently experiencing trauma. And so really being able to be present and emotionally connected and providing them with that safe space to be emotionally connected is the most important things that you can provide. And discipline, you do want structure. Structure is important, but discipline oftentimes needs to go on the back burner. And I, in fact, have a situation where I attempted tough love with one of my kids because they were going through something pretty extreme. And I was like, they were using drugs. And I was like, well, you can't use drugs in my house. Guess what they did? They went and lived with dad, right? So, so then I talked with a therapist who specializes in parental alienation, and she was like, yeah, tough love does not work when you have a toxic ex, even when you're dealing with something like drugs.
Right. So what do you do? What's the answer? I feel like I'm trying to think about putting myself in your shoes. Like they need to know that it's not okay. You also don't want to enable them, right? Like you don't want to create a codependent relationship either. You need to help them feel empowered. But how do you do that in a situation where they're doing something that's harmful?
Yeah. So what's really important is learning to connect with your child, right? So this is a few years back, right? So definitely one of the things I feel like I did not well early on in the divorce is finding that emotional connection, because I was implementing structure and discipline, or attempting to, and all those things, right? So I'm sharing this as from learned experience rather from having done this well, right? And the number one thing you can do is learn to connect with your child. And it's something that people really struggle with, especially when you have a toxic ex who's constantly undermining you. But find those things, like something you have in common, something you do every single week. Maybe it's going on, an activity that they like to do. Maybe it's, whatever it is, having dinner together. That was something we did do, is we had dinner together. But create opportunities for connection. And hopefully that will minimize or avoid some of these bigger events, right? So something I could have done differently in this particular situation has been like, wow, honey, like, I'm really concerned that you're using drugs. Let's talk about why that is and what that is. And empowering them is really important, rather than like top down, like authoritative parenting, right? So in that particular moment, because it felt so extreme to me, I switched into authoritative parenting, right?
Well, that's probably from fear of when we're afraid of a potential outcome or someone getting hurt that we love, we want to control it.
We want to control it. Exactly. And so something that may have been worked better is like, let's figure out what's going on that you feel the need to use drugs. And what do you need? And how can I support you? What would feel better for you? He probably would have said, I don't know, because that's his response to everything, right? But so the bottom line for listeners from that example is to find ways to achieve that structure. Because correct, you don't want to be permissive. That's why it's just parenting with a narcissistic ex, I think, is one of the most difficult and most painful things, because you're constantly walking that line. So you want to have structure and be there for your child and support them without enabling or being permissive, right? So it's finding that point of connection and giving them some choice and power. How would you like, this is not okay, you can't do drugs in my house. What are some ways that we can address this? What are some things that you're willing to do? Are you willing to go to a counselor? Are you willing to have, daily room checks? I'm going to check your room. Maybe you don't ask their permission for that. Maybe you just do it, right? But finding ways to implement that structure without the tough love, without the, you have to do this. And then they're like, all right, fine, we'll go to the other house.
Yeah. I think even just as a parent, just understanding that when they become dependent on a substance or they're doing something that's self-harm, understanding that it's their attempt to numb themselves from emotional, spiritual, maybe even physical or psychological pain that they are experiencing, and recognizing that, don't make it about you, right? Like don't internalize that like it's your fault or you should have done this better or you should have done something different or, whatever it might be. It's more about looking at them and having that empathy for, well, what's really going on underneath, like at a deeper level. And then to your point, like asking them those questions either to get to that truth, or if they're not willing to be open to sharing with you vulnerably, because maybe there is maybe some sense of shame about it, because that can happen as well, right? They know probably deep down that this is not something that they should be doing. Maybe they're ashamed that they can't stop or whatever it might be. So asking that question of like, well, how can I support you? What support would feel good for you? Would it be talking to someone else? Like who do we trust that you can talk to, right? Because opening up those lines of communication and like you said, like creating that deeper connection is more important than the you can't do that and that's not allowed and making them feel even worse about it.
Right, exactly. And to kind of follow that through is, so in that particular example, he went to go live with dads. I had my moment of freaking out and what can I do? And then moved into that acceptance. And I went back to hold the vision, shift my energy, not take it personal, and I reached out to him and said, I don't think I handled this in the best possible way. And for that, I'm sorry. And I'm here for you. And, we continue to have a relationship. And he's, by the way, doing well. This was a couple of years ago. He's doing well now. And we were able to then communicate and maintain a relationship, even though he went to go live with dad. It was like my worst fear, right? We were still able to have a relationship because of the first two steps. And what you were just talking about, not taking it personal, right? The only way you can really do that is if you've done your self-healing and you've learned how to be free from triggers. And then you can implement parenting approaches and tools. But those first two are so important to have in place, because otherwise, like, you as a parent with a toxic ex and a manipulative ex, you are going to face things that are really painful, that are going to feel personal, all these kinds of things. And there's no way to navigate those effectively when you are taking them personal, you're feeling pain.
Yeah. I just want to say one thing about like being free from triggers, because I don't want people to be under the impression that they're never going to get triggered again, because they will in other relationships. I think what you're trying to describe is like the things that may have triggered you in the past in your relationship with your narcissistic ex are things that you can create space, right? Like from my experience, it's like we're increasing the flexibility in our vagal brake, so to say. So we're increasing the gap between the trigger and how we respond. And the way we do that is by doing this deep inner work to understand, what it feels like in our body when we're triggered, what emotions are coming up, and then what are the thoughts, what are the stories, what are the beliefs that are tied to that, and how do we disentangle from it so that we can understand a lot more quickly what core wound is being poked and prodded in that moment, so that we can then reaffirm for ourselves that, okay, I understand my belief that I'm not important got triggered in this moment. Now, how do I want to respond so that I don't have to have that emotional overreaction or come in with my defensive coping mechanisms in order to battle and to fight it out, right? I can come from a more grounded perspective and rationally engage in a way that feels more maybe vulnerable, but maybe also that is more productive to having effective communication about whatever's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's definitely the process of that I teach as well in terms of triggers. I will say that you don't want to give the impression you'll never be triggered again. Yes, we're human beings. So we're going to have emotional responses. That's just how we're designed. However, I will say that for me, at least, and for my clients like that I've worked with, once you really understand a core wound that's causing you to be triggered and you've shifted it, you are not likely to be triggered about that again. And so when I say triggered, just to clarify, it's what you just said, an over response, a disproportionate response to a situation. So I'm glad you brought this up, actually, because I've had clients ask about this. When I say that you'll never get triggered, I don't mean that you're not going to have emotions, right? So for example, I've had clients that I've worked with for a while who come to me and they're like, Veronika, I was so angry this weekend and I thought I was done with being triggered and I don't understand. And I'm like, share with me what happened. And they share and I'm like, you're angry because that's the valid response for that situation. It doesn't mean that you're triggered, right? So to me, triggered means something happens and you have a disproportionate response or an emotion that doesn't match the situation. And it causes, like we were talking about earlier, this hours or days of being in that emotion and trying to resolve it and ruminating, thinking about it. That when I say trigger, that's what I mean. So from that standpoint, I would say, yes, you can get to a point where you won't be triggered again. You might have an emotion, but you have the emotion, you're like, I see you, emotion. And then you move on with you're able to respond. You're able to respond instead of react.
You're no longer acting from that emotion. That's the point. It's like you're not acting from that emotion or even the thoughts and the beliefs that that emotion sponsors. And that's where you unblend from all of that, right? You gave us good tools and good insights. I appreciate it so much. And I know that the listeners absolutely got something out of this conversation for sure. So thank you for sharing your brilliance, your wisdom, the evidence and the experiments that you have tried and tested, and sharing those results with us so that everyone can see a path forward on how they can move through something that feels really difficult. Because as you know, parenting is hard enough as it is. And then having to do that with someone who is toxic and unhealthy can be even more stressful. And it can leave us in a state of overwhelm where instead of being the parent that we want to be, we're overwhelmed and we're exhausted and we're numbed out and we are not able to connect then in the way that we want to with our children. So thank you so much. Veronika, is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners or anything that you have coming up that you want to let them know about?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. And I love supporting parents who have a toxic ex because I think it's one of the most difficult and most painful things to navigate. So I love supporting parents with that. And I do have a free masterclass that I'm happy to offer to your listeners that goes into more depth about the things that we were talking about here today. So it's 3 kind of pillars. One is healing yourself. The second one, which we didn't talk about so much, is healing your child through trauma healing parenting. And then the third step is navigating the system, the tools and strategies for when you're dealing with courts and all the different secondary parties that are involved when you're parenting, and how to navigate them effectively because your ex is constantly trying to undermine and sabotage you. So I think it's a 3-part masterclass with 2 bonuses that goes into those 3 pillars.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's so generous of you. And listeners, we're going to include the links in the show notes so that you can find it easier. And then you'll also be able to connect with Veronika directly because we'll have all of her contact information in there as well. Thank you so much again, Veronika, for taking your time to have this conversation and for the work that you're doing in this world. Thank you for tuning in to Awaken Her. Today's conversation may have ended, but your journey towards healing and empowerment is ongoing. Remember, every challenge you face is an opportunity to grow stronger and more resilient. If our stories today inspired you, consider sharing this episode with someone who needs these empowering messages. I'm Corissa Stepp, cheering you on as you take the steps to heal, grow, and transform your life. Keep believing in yourself, and until next time, stay empowered.